Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. The official visit of the President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, in the United Arab Emirates ended today. And today he went in the direction of the Turkey, where he was going to have a meeting with the President of Turkey, Erdogan. Most likely both Zelensky and Erdogan are planning to discuss the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine between Russian Federation and Ukraine itself. Meanwhile, the Russian delegation arrived on the territory of Saudi Arabia. The Russian delegation will be represented by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov. From the other side, we see that the delegation from the United States of America has arrived also on the territory of Saudi Arabia. Telling the truth, by the time I start making the video, the negotiation process between the United States of America and the Russian Federation has already started. Furthermore, we got additional details and additional information from this process. For example, this is the video how the Russian delegation arrived. Two men, the Minister of the Foreign Affairs and Mr. Ushakov, arrived on the territory of Saudi Arabia. From the other side, we see the arriving of the US Secretary of State Rubio. He also arrived almost at the same time with the Russians. And later we start receiving the first videos and first details of the negotiation process. In this video we can see most likely maybe 1 or 5 or 10 minutes before the beginning of the negotiation process between two delegations, the delegation of Russian Federation and the delegation of the United States of America. And right several minutes before I start making the video, we got first details. Let's discuss first details in details. Progress in Russia-US economic talks is possible in the next 2 or 3 months. That was stated by the Russians. What is known at this minute, a press conference is planned in Riyadh following the talks between Russia and the United States of America. The US suffered more damage than Russia due to sanctions. Russia and the US should continue to develop joint projects, including cooperation in the Arctic. Western IT companies and media lost 123 billion as a result of sanctions imposed against Russia. The Biden administration misled the world community about the state of the Russian economy. At the moment, there have been no negotiations between Russia and the United States on transporting gas through the remaining branch of the Nord Stream gas pipeline. So this is exactly what is known at this minute. Most likely by the time you may watch this video or even during the day, we're going to receive additional details. And the most important, that this evening we're going to have a press conference and then we're going to understand everything. Of course, both the Russians and the Americans are talking about Ukraine, and they're talking about Ukraine a lot. And I believe that we can more or less understand what exactly at least the Russians were talking about. Because, for example, today, the UN representative Nebenzia gave us a lot of very interesting information. Let's discuss the statements made by the representative in the United Nations organization from the Russian side. The implementation of new agreements on Ukraine should be handled by the government in Kiev that emerges as a result of democratic elections, which means that Zelensky is not going to be a person who will sign any agreements between Russia and the United States of America and Ukraine itself. Russian permanent representative to the United Nations Security Council Nebenzia said that there is a chance that the hot phase of the Ukraine crisis might soon end. According to information we have, both the Russians and the Americans are planning to finish the conflict somewhere by the 20th of April. Few more statements made by Nebenzia. The European Union countries and Great Britain are absolutely incapable of reaching any agreement. They cannot be a party to any future agreements on Ukraine. In the future, Ukraine must be a demilitarized and neutral state that is not part of any blocs or alliances. Ukraine has lost the DPR, LPR, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. The authorities in Kiev elected in democratic elections must implement new agreements with Russia. So from these updates, from these things, we can say one thing for sure, that first, we're gonna see negotiations between Russia and the United States of America. Then we're going to have some agreement or the ceasefire. Maybe these two things are going to take place at the same moment. The ceasefire and agreements between the Russian Federation and then the United States of America. Then USA will force Ukrainians to accept these agreements and to stop the martial law. Then the Ukrainians will make elections and they will elect another president. Maybe they will elect Zelensky, who knows? And only then Ukrainians, somewhere after October of 2025, will sign any agreements with the Russian Federation and will confirm everything that was, let's say, achieved by the Russians and the Americans during this negotiation process. So this is something like a perfect picture for Russians and for Americans. But let's discuss Ukraine, what exactly is happening there. And according to information we have today, Germany announced another additional military package. Obviously, as the Russians reported, European countries can't take place in this negotiation process because basically they don't want this negotiation process to happen. They don't want this peace agreement to be signed. Germany has announced a new military aid package for Ukraine. It includes 56 protected vehicles, significant number of missiles, artillery shells, drones, and many other equipment that Ukrainians are going to use in war with Russia. So we see that European countries most likely will not accept any agreements between the Russian Federation and Ukraine itself if these agreements, I don't know, doesn't fit their requirements. Furthermore, during the previous night, the Russians launched massive drone strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine, and during the previous night there were a lot of explosions on the territory of the capital of Ukraine in Kiev, and according to information we have, the Russians, as a result of this massive drone strike, managed to damage Ukrainian energy facilities. So while Zelensky is traveling around the world, the Russians destroy Ukrainian facilities. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and telling the truth when talking about the situation on the ground. Obviously, the Ukrainians don't have these 6 or 8 months because the Russians are breaking through the Ukrainian defense, and if the situation continues developing the same way, most likely Ukrainian defense will collapse in 1 or 2 or 3 months. Let's discuss in details. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to enter the company stronghold that located to the northwest of Velika Novoselovka. This information was provided us by pro-Ukrainian sources, and this is very important offensive operation. By this attack, the Russians managed to cut the main supply lines that Ukrainians were using to support their units and forces on the territory of the stronghold. From the other side, the Russians continue offensive from the settlement of Novokamar in the direction of this stronghold from the east. So from one side, the Russians block the Ukrainians from supply and support, and from another side, the Russians are trying to advance. And we have video that confirm this Russian offensive operation. Currently, we can make a conclusion. There are very heavy clashes for this company stronghold, and if Ukrainians lose this stronghold, this is going to be a complete disaster for the armored forces of Ukraine in this direction. Ukrainians don't have lots of strongholds and trenches and fortifications in this area, and most likely they will be forced to fall back. Now let's discuss the situation in the area between the settlements of Ulakli, Constantinopil and Andreevka. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours we have significant changes on the ground. Let's discuss them in details. First, let's talk about this pocket. Yesterday, lots of pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to cut this pocket completely, to encircle the Ukrainians, and a lot of Ukrainians surrendered and become prisoners of war. We have a lot of videos that confirm that the Russians captured lots of Ukrainians from this pocket. And just today, in the morning, by the morning of the 18th of February, the neutral mappers confirmed this information. So as for now, we are going to keep this area as a contested area until we get better information or better geolocations. Now let's discuss the situation and the settlement of Ulakli itself. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the fields and along the river of Sukhye Yali. So this small pocket was taken by the Russians, as you can see. And furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to take under control the most western part of the settlement, which means that Ukrainians lost possibilities to evacuate their soldiers along N15 road from the settlement of Ulakli towards the village of Constantinopil. So the Ukrainians were caught in cauldron in the northern part of the settlement, and most likely tomorrow we will color the village completely. And maybe the Russians, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, will confirm this information. Now let's discuss the situation in Constantinople, because the situation in this area is very critical as well. The Russian offensive, this Russian big offensive, started on the 16th of February of 2025. So this is the situation, for example, by the end of the 15th of February, and this is the situation by the end of the 16th of February. And we got the first report from the pro-Ukrainian sources that the Russians began their full-scale offensive, and as a result of Russian full-scale offensive operation, they managed to enter the southeastern part of Constantinople. And we were waiting for additional updates whether the Russians managed to improve their positions or not. By the end of the 17th of February, it became clear that most likely the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the settlement, that the Russians managed to take under control fortifications, tree lines and fields around the southern part of the settlement. But as for the end of the 17th of February, we didn't have any geolocation that could confirm Russian presence on the territory of the settlement itself. And by the beginning of the 18th of February, we got the first geolocation published by the Ukrainian side that confirmed the Russian presence in the most southern and the southwestern part of the settlement. In this video we can see the Ukrainian tank that came to this area and how Ukrainian tank was attacking the Russian positions in this territory of the settlement. The Russians realized that the situation is very critical for the Russian troopers, so that's why the Russians sent the significant number of FPV drones with the purpose to destroy this tank and to destroy this dangerous situation. As you can see, as a result of Russian FPV drone attacks, Ukrainian tank was completely destroyed. Now let's discuss once again in details. As a result of clashes during the previous days, the Russians managed to block the M15 road from the southwest. And the Ukrainians during the previous days made lots of attempts to counterattack the Russians, and for those purposes the Ukrainians were using tanks and armored vehicles. And one of the tanks came to this point and was attacking the Russians from a very close distance. The Russians sent a lot of FPV drones that were using the fiber optic technology, and Ukrainian tanks were destroyed, which means that the Russians managed to save their presence in the southern and the southwestern part of the settlement. And this situation means that the Ukrainians that are located in the central and in the northern part of Constantinople were caught in cauldron as well. So summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that the Ukrainians, the armored forces of Ukraine, the Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian troopers that are currently located in this pocket, in this area, were caught in cauldron by the Russians as a result of offensive operations that have been taking place since the 15th of February of 2025. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the settlement of Andreeva. According to pro-Ukrainian sources, during the previous 24 hours, during the previous night, the armored forces of Russian Federation managed to improve their positions significantly. The Russians improved their positions in the most northern part of the settlement by taking under control several tree lines, several fortifications and one stronghold in this area. So we see that the battle for these territories is about to be finished. The Russians by this offensive are able to maintain the lines, the most important to shorten the lines, to release lots of soldiers that can be used for further advance in the directions of the settlements of Alexeyevka and the settlement of Bogatyr. So we see that the battle for this part of Donetsk region is coming to an end. Now let's discuss the situation in the city of Pakros. I'll remind you that during the previous several days the Russians managed to restore their positions and control over the settlement of Peshchana completely. But the Ukrainians continued their counterattacks, and those counterattacks were very difficult for the Russians, and the Russians realized that sooner or later the weather is going to become worse, and obviously they would not be able to hold their positions because the Ukrainians have advantage in this area. So that's why the Russians Russians at this stage of the Pakrovsk offensive operation decided to destroy the bridges and logistic in this area, and this operation, this situation, of course, allowed the Russians to win some time. They win some time by the fact that they managed to destroy the bridge in this area. This bridge was destroyed, and of course the Ukrainians now don't have this let's say logistic, they don't have this flexibility in their attacks, and now it's going to become much more difficult for the Ukrainians to counterattack the Russians in Pishchane. And from the other side, this will allow the Russians to attack in the direction of Zverova, and today we got lots of reports that there are already very heavy clashes for this settlement. If the Russians can take the settlement under complete control, this is going to be a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians. Now let's discuss the situation in the Constantinovka direction. If you remember, yesterday the head of DPR reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over Kliban-Byk landscape park near Konstantinovka. When talking about this area, this is the park the Russians were talking about, but most likely the head of DPR made a mistake when was talking about this. As for today, we have some improvements on the ground. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they were attacking the Russian units in the central, in the most western part of the settlement of Novospaska. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. Yes, the Russians managed to improve. Of course, they're very far from taking under control this park, but obviously they managed to improve their positions, and the Russians are moving exactly in this direction. As for the city of Chasiv, we have one important update. When talking about the Konstantinofka offensive operation, we understand that the Russians are trying to create the situation when they will be able to attack this city from three directions. The first one is along N32 road. The Russians have already begun advancing in this area. The Russians are going to attack the city of Konstantinovka from the city of Toretsk. As for now, we also see that the Russians are improving their positions and getting closer and closer. And the main strike, the main attack, the Russians are going to carry out between the cities of Bakhmut, Chasiv, and Konstantinovka. This direction is going to be the primary because this is the shortest direction between the city of Chasiv and the city of Konstantinovka. So that's why the Russians pay significant attention exactly to this area. And during this month, during the previous months, we got another report that the Russians are trying to improve logistics in this area. The Russians, as you can see, are building something like protection nets, protection fortifications, protection constructions along supply lines that will allow the Russians to redeploy units, fighting vehicles, tanks to the line of combat contact without losses. The Russians are trying to create something that will destroy and that will not allow the Ukrainian drones to destroy Russian vehicles, which means that this direction is going to be probably the primary direction where the Russians are going to use probably the biggest number of tanks, vehicles ever to attack the city of Konstantinovka. Once again, something tells me that the battle for Konstantinovka is going to be very fast. As for the Sivers direction, nothing. As for the southern Kupiansk direction, we have additional report from the village of Yampolovka. According to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over this village, and the battle for Taskoye has begun. And that's it for the short video. Military summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.